I'm going to be reviewing the latest Alone in the Dark remake and answering the question of whether or not it's worth getting. Now, we're first going to start with the non-spoiler section, but then we'll move on to my spoiler section of the video where I'll discuss my nitpicks, things I liked about the game, and things that could be improved if they were to make a sequel remake of Alone in the Dark 2. And finally, we'll go over my final review score. I'll make sure to include chapters for all of those sections. So as mentioned, we'll first start with the non-spoiler section of the game. Now, I don't want to spend too much time in this section of the video, but the first thing I'll say is that if you're a Resident Evil fan, then I highly recommend this game. As I stated several times in my videos, Alone in the Dark released in 1992, and it was actually one of the games that inspired Resident Evil. Now, of course, Resident Evil had a lot of other medias, movies, other video games as well that inspired it, but Alone in the Dark was definitely one of them. Now, I should also preface before we continue on with this video that, Alone in the Dark is actually $60 USD, and of course, I think if you're on PlayStation, you got PlayStation Plus, you do get a couple of dollars off. I think it's $10, but correct me if I'm wrong. But regardless, I just wanted to state that I'm not going to be critiquing this game as I would, a new game that's selling around, $70 or $80 USD. Now, for those of you that don't know what the game's about, Alone in the Dark is set in the late 1920s. The game starts by explaining that Edward Carnby, series regular, has been hired by Emily Hartward to investigate her uncle's disappearance. Emily's uncle was staying at Derceto Manor, a clinic dealing with mentally unwell patients north of New Orleans, but what you end up finding in the manor is something way more disturbing. Now, the other thing that I should also mention too is right at the beginning of the game, this is all pretty much explained. She basically mentions that her uncle sent her a letter that also explains that there's some sort of cult, involvement. So that's basically what the game starts off with. And as mentioned, the first original game basically released in 1992. So it's a really old game. Now, the one thing that I will say, again, if you guys are looking to buy this game, is that the puzzles are really amazing. I actually really like the puzzles in this game. I would say 98% of all the puzzles in the game make complete logical sense. I think for me, there's probably like two puzzles where I was kind of confused. I was like, this doesn't really make sense. Was it the same person that made all the other puzzles? Because all of the other puzzles are well made, they're well thought out. And that's one of the things that I really enjoyed. It almost felt like I've never been to an escape room, but it kind of felt like that. Like Alone in the Dark is no stranger to puzzles. I grew up playing Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare. Never beat it. I want to do that on stream. And I also played, the PS3, PS2, Alone in the Dark Inferno. And that game specifically made you think outside the box a lot. But Alone in the Dark has always been filled with puzzles. So playing this game, you should not be surprised that you're going to be encountering puzzles all the time. I don't know. It just felt really nice to always go to another logical puzzle, and then you're figuring it out. If you guys were watching me on stream, we did play through the whole game when it released, and that was a blast. That was really fun, kind of figuring it out. And then I think one puzzle I actually figured out like by accident, and then so that was cool. That happens sometimes, but yeah, I honestly had a blast playing this game. Now, of course, this game is really amazing, but it did have some issues that I should kind of point out to you guys. So one of the things that I will say, without getting too much into detail, again, as mentioned, we'll dive into those issues later on in the video. But the thing that I need to mention for sure is that there's not much replayability. One would think that if you played as Emily or, Edward, you're going to experience two completely different scenarios, very similar to like Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 2 Remake, but that is definitely not the case here. In fact, whether you play as Edward or Emily, you're going to be kind of going throughout the whole game in a very similar way. The only thing that's obviously going to be different is the character's reactions to certain circumstances, but it's very negligible, like the amount of differences that you'll find in each character. The other thing that I should mention as well is that the game isn't very long. My first playthrough of the game that I streamed live on the channel took me roughly 8 hours, and my second playthrough took me around 4 hours to complete. Though I should mention that the reason my second playthrough took that long was mostly due to the fact that I was recording footage, so I wasn't skipping cutscenes. So I imagine without cutscenes, and if you know what you're doing, you can definitely speedrun this game easy. The one thing I will say without spoiling anything is that each character has like one area which is very specific to that character, but everything else, I would say probably like 90% or like 85% of the game is exactly the same. Even the puzzles. So you're not going to find different combinations for different puzzles if you play as Emily or Edward. So of course, it's not like Resident Evil 2 where, if you play B scenario or A scenario, there's going to be different solutions for puzzles. That's definitely not the case with Alone in the Dark, which, to be honest, I don't think is that much of like a nitpick for me. I honestly didn't really like like that in Resident Evil 2. If anything, it kind of reminded me of Resident Evil 1, but you know what? We'll touch upon that later on in the video. And the other thing that I should also mention as well, that a lot of reviewers have been talking about because it is like a glaring issue in the game, is kind of the combat system. Now, the combat system is not great. You know, you do have melee weapons that you have to use, and it's very janky. The other thing that I'll also add is that the dodging mechanic is a bit strange. So, you know how in most games, like even like Resident Evil 3 Remake, you have kind of 3 dodges from enemies, and then Jill kind of gets a little tired. This game doesn't have that. It's very old school in the fact that if you keep pressing circle, you could just infinitely dodge. But the dodging has like a weird stutter. Now, this could just be because I'm playing, you know, an early, you know, not a patched version of the game. Maybe they'll patch it later on to kind of fix that stutter. But at the moment, I will say the biggest issues, like in performance, I think are probably, you know, the fighting and as well as the dodging. But in any case, those are probably the only glaring issues I have without going into spoilers. But just to wrap this section up, and as mentioned, if you guys are thinking about getting this game, I do highly recommend it as a survival horror fan, and of course, as a Resident Evil fan. You know, there's even, the only thing I'll say is that there is an Easter egg or reference to the Resident Evil remakes. So without going into spoilers, anyways, highly recommend Alone in the Dark. Okay, now that that section is over with, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this review video. And to start, I actually want to go over the nitpicks. Okay, so my first nitpick that I had with the game is the weird fact that smaller enemies did way more damage compared to bigger enemy types. I don't know why this was the case, but you know, just from the top of my head, the enemies that I'm referring to specifically are, for example, the bat that can be encountered in like the crypt, the Egyptian crypt area. They do a lot of damage, but the good thing about them is that they only take like 1 handgun bullet, so it's not that bad. But even worse example of this is probably the crab enemies that you can find in the ship in the bayou section of the game. Those enemies, they take off so much damage, and you actually see them again in the finale, in the final boss fight. And those enemies are so annoying. I don't know why they made them like that. Like, they actually have a huge buff in health and as well as damage, but they're like little creatures. So I don't know. I thought that was weird that the bigger creatures just did minimal damage compared to the smaller enemies. But I don't know. Let me know if you guys agree with that nitpick. Another nitpick that I had with the game is the fact that a lot of the characters looked very similar. I think the only characters in the whole entirety of the game that look very different was probably the 2 main characters, so Emily Hartwood, Edward Carnby, the little girl, Grace, I don't remember her last name, and the drunk guy that was kind of like her chaperone. Those were the only people that looked slightly different. Everybody else, everyone else looked exactly the same. Like, you can tell they all had the same eyes, the same like facial structure. I would even go as far as to say that like Jeremy, the Dr. Gray, the first housekeeper lady, and even the dark man, they all look the same. They all look like they're the same person. So I don't know what, you know, what happened there, but I thought it was very strange, especially since the 2 protagonists, you know, are that, you know, Edward Carnby and as well as Emily Hartwood look pretty much identical to their actors that are playing them, you know, David Harbour and Jodie Comer. So if anything, that was just a minor issue that I had, and it kind of just took me out of the story a lot, because I'd be like, wow, is this Dr. Gray looks like exactly like Jeremy, who looks exactly like Lottie, who looks exactly like Baptiste, who looks like every character. Now, as we just discussed, the third nitpick that I had was obviously the combat. The combat was, yeah, very janky. It almost felt like a PS2 game, if I'm being honest. Especially with like the lack of like lock-on system. Sometimes I'd be hitting an enemy and I would just be hitting them kind of like from the right side or the left side. I'm like barely hitting them. So the lock-on feature was a bit strange. I also wasn't a big fan of like R1 and holding R1 on PlayStation, which was basically just the light attack or the heavy attack. But the one thing that made no sense for me was that whichever one you used, light or heavy, it still looked the same. So that kind of just made it kind of useless. Like, why am I going to use a heavy attack if the light attack and the heavy attack kind of do the same? damage, or they look this like they do the same damage. So that was kind of weird. Not a big fan of the combat. And similarly, as I've already stated, the dodging was a huge issue as well, because you could literally just infinitely dodge and keep dodging. So I think if they had capped the dodge to something very similar to like Resident Evil 3 Remake, where, you know, Jill only has like 3 dodges back to back, and then the third dodge that you do kind of makes you tired. So it kind of just incentivizes the player to kind of take a break and kind of also know like, hey, I've used 2 dodges. I'm only going to use a third dodge if I really need it, you know? I think that would have helped with this whole survival horror aspect. Now, another thing that I also didn't mention in the non-spoiler section, which I forgot to, was the running. The running felt a little off, especially the transition from dodge to run back to dodge. I thought that was a little slowed down. It almost felt like your character didn't know what to do. And the other thing too is that I actually checked in settings and the running was set to toggle on. So you would just click the button and the character would keep running. I think that was the best. I don't know if that's the default setting. Personally, that was the best, instead of holding down the button to kind of run, because you kind of have to hold it kind of hard. I don't know if that was just my experience, but let me know. Another nitpick that this game had that was super disappointing was the fact that there was no hand-to-hand combat. This is super strange, especially since, you know, I never beat the OG Alone in the Dark games. They were way before my time, but I did play the prologue of the first Alone in the Dark, and in that one, you could do hand-to-hand combat. You know, as you could actually go with Edward and kind of do like an old-timey boxing kind of position, and you could kind of do a left or right hook. You could also do a left crescent kick or right crescent kick. So I think that mechanic should have definitely have been implemented in the remake. I don't know why they just decided to omit this. Now that I think about it, it's probably because they had so many issues with just a melee component. You know, it probably didn't work. So them adding a left hook and a right hook and a crescent kick would have been a little bit strange. So I definitely think that the, you know, THQ Nordic, if they are going to make a sequel, that's definitely something that needs to be incorporated. The other thing that I wasn't a fan of was the fact that they didn't make both protagonist stories cohesive to one another. So in other words, both scenarios, if you will, felt like 2 separate stories rather than having one story told from 2 different perspectives. By having the game tell 2 what-if versions of the same story kind of just makes the gamer question which version of the story is actually canon. Is it Emily's scenario or Edward's scenario? Well, since we know Edward Carnby is the main character that continues to fight paranormal entities in future installments, it's kind of a given that Edward's perspective or scenario here is truly the one that's canon. But if that's the case, then it just renders Emily's perspective or scenario here mostly useless at the end of the day. Personally, I think it would have been better to have both characters traverse and solve the Derceto mansion case together by having the characters split up every now and again and then regrouping to share what they had found out about Jeremy's disappearance. This would have enabled both stories to be cohesive, and it would also give us an incentive to see both characters' perspective. This would have helped the game have more replayability, in my opinion, and it would have also fixed the issue of Emily's scenario being rendered mostly useless, since at the end of the day, the way the game is at the moment, the only real difference between scenarios is literally just the unique memory sections. So for Edward, that's going through the streets and plaza of New Orleans, and finally the Bayou section, remembering a previous case he'd worked on, and Emily going through World War I trenches and having access to the surgical hallway area in the basement of Derceto. At the end of the day, I'm not a fan of having one character do all of the legwork of solving the case while the other character literally just goofs off. Similarly, RE1 and RE1 Remake both share this problem as well. As you guys have probably heard me state this in previous videos, one of the things that I did not like about Resident Evil 1 was the fact that if you played as Jill, you save Barry and Chris, but you don't save Rebecca, and vice versa. If you play as Chris, you save Rebecca and Jill, but you don't see Barry. So that's a huge kind of plot hole, and that's exactly what I felt with Alone in the Dark. It felt like why am I playing as Emily if I know that, you know, Edward's story is the real one? Because obviously Edward has Alone in the Dark 2, Alone in the Dark 3, New Nightmare, Inferno. It would have made more sense if they had kind of done what the book of Umbrella Conspiracy did with the S.C. Perry novel, where they kind of just made each character, Chris and Jill, traverse through the whole mansion at the same time. That would have fixed this game's issue as well. By the way, guys, we're actually on the grind to 10K subscribers. So if you guys are enjoying the content, consider subscribing, and also make sure to leave a like, because actually YouTube really likes that. But in any case, let's get back to the video. Now, another issue I had with the game was the pacing. I thought the story especially the climax of the game and also the finale felt rushed. It almost felt like the creative director and the writer for the game had to go to the bathroom. It honestly felt it finished off really quick. I didn't like how right in the climax of the game, you're in the Arctic, you're kind of fighting, Jeremy, you stab him in the eye, and then you go back to the real world, and then you get put to sleep because they saw you stab Jeremy, and then you wake up, and then you talk to everybody and the ritual, and then that's it, essentially. Basically, you do the final boss fight, and then boom, bada bing, bada boom, you're done with the story. It felt really rushed. I thought it should have, there should have been another act or another chapter in between the Arctic scene and as well as the finale with the ritual. But anyways, those are all of the nitpicks that I had with the game. Now let's go over the things that I liked about Alone in the Dark. So the first thing that I actually have to talk about is bringing in David Harbour as Edward Carnby. This is actually such a great casting. And the reason I say that is because, as mentioned, I never beat the OG Alone in the Dark, but I did play the prologue. And if you listen to the voice actor that plays the OG Edward and you listen to David Harbour, they kind of sound exactly the same. So I think it's great casting.
The others call me the Reptile. I don't care to think what my banker calls me. These days, I leave my letters unopened. Bills and...
No, I'm a private investigator. Sorry to bother you. My client's worried about her uncle. He's a patient here at Tercetto. If you don't mind, could you direct us where to find him?
No, I can't. Jeremy has gone missing.
And it's honestly pretty cool because this is like the first time we've seen David Harbour in a video game, up to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, seeing him, fully fleshed out, as Edward was super cool. And I'm a huge fan of David Harbour's work, especially from Stranger Things. Now, another thing that I actually really liked about this game was the throwing / chucking mechanic that they implemented. I don't know what they did, but it honestly felt really good by pressing R2. Like, you could actually feel in the controller. I don't know if this is just a PS5 thing. Maybe it's just a haptic feedback, but it felt really nice. Now, it kind of reminded me a little bit of like Last of Us in the fact that, you could get your Molotov or a brick. But the cool thing about this mechanic, as one of my viewers stated, was the fact that you don't really carry around Molotovs and bricks. You kind of just find them in the world and you kind of just pick them up and you just chuck them. I love that mechanic. If more games implemented that, I don't know, that feeling of like really chucking something, I thought they nailed really great in this game. Now, another thing that I really liked about this game was the sound design. The creaking of the manor, the voices you could hear in the dark at certain times, and the overall background music, I thought really complemented the game really well. Like, as soon as you start the game and you go inside the manor, you start hearing things kind of like, scurrying in the corner. You hear like a creature like in a little pot. You'll hear like a door kind of open or like things kind of hitting the window. Those kinds of sounds just very, like, it really added to like the environment. It really made the game kind of feel haunted. I really liked that. That was one of the things that I really loved. And as mentioned, the music was really great, especially since it's set in the 1920s. You're having a lot of jazz. It kind of just added to this kind of noir detective atmosphere throughout the whole game, especially if you're playing through Edward's kind of memory, kind of going through, New Orleans, kind of downtown in the plaza. And that's another thing that I should also mention too, is that the environments in this game were amazing. I really love the locations of everything. As mentioned, we were just talking about New Orleans. I love going down the French Quarter in like one of Jeremy's memories. I loved going in Edward's memories, going through the plaza, going through all the French Quarter, Bourbon Street of New Orleans. I've never been to New Orleans, but it seems like a really cool place. And, seeing that, all of the European architecture and just seeing the spookiness of it all, right? Like, New Orleans is well known to be a spooky place, like especially Bourbon Street. I've heard like there's a bunch of hauntings, like you'll go into a restaurant or something and then you'll talk to a waiter, but the waiter, nobody works at that place, like there's no waiter, and so you're basically talking to a ghost. Like, that's like what I'm saying is that there's a lot of paranormal activity in New Orleans, so having the game be set there was really amazing. Another thing that I also really liked was when you played in Emily's memory, where you kind of were brought to World War I in the trenches. That was one of the things that I really liked because I didn't even expect to go to Europe in this game. So as mentioned, all of the locations, going through like Egypt, going to downtown New Orleans, or even in the bayou, with the ship section or like in the swamp area, it kind of, brought me back to Red Dead Redemption 2, which of course is set in, Saint Denis is what they call it in the game, but in reality, it is based off of New Orleans. Yeah, it kind of teleported me to La Grasse in Red Dead Redemption or Saint Denis. But yeah, really cool atmosphere. I really loved the locations in this game. Oh, and you know what? The other thing that I actually forgot to mention about Emily's kind of World War I trenches was there's one scene in that whole area that I really liked. That was very different from the rest of the game. And that was the whole section where Emily kind of goes through like a trench and kind of tries to open a door and it's locked. And then when she looks behind her, there's a huge monster chasing her. If anything, that whole section felt like a nightmare, and it was kind of a shame that the rest of the game didn't really feel like that. So I think if they were to make a sequel, I definitely think that they need to add this for sure, because that's something that was kind of spooky. You know, like I said, it felt like a nightmare. So I really enjoyed that part. It kind of built the tension up because you're like, well, I can't do anything, so I guess I'm getting kid. And then sure enough, that was part of the cinematic for the next scene. The other thing that I also mentioned about Emily's memory as well that I really liked was the whole surgery room that's kind of locked for Edward's kind of story. I really liked that whole area as well. I like the puzzles in that section and kind of just the overall atmosphere. And the last thing that I really liked about this game was all of the characters. I thought the lore that each character had was amazing, and I loved how, you know, you could actually find a clue and kind of look into everybody's bio, since everybody was, you know, the majority of people were patients in there. But not only just the patients, I really like Dr. Gray. I really like Lottie as well, and I really like Baptiste. I think all of the characters just were all very sus, in my opinion. So it kind of just, at the end of the day, it kind of just felt like the whole game was kind of like a game of Clue. And so it kind of added to the atmosphere of having all of these weird people that are in this mansion that you can't really trust 100%. So it just made everybody just very sus, as mentioned, which I really enjoyed. And now we'll move on to the section of what can be improved, especially if THQ Nordic decides to make another remake for Alone in the Dark 2. Well, for starters, I think the next game's combat definitely needs to be improved. As I stated earlier, I definitely think that adding the hand-to-hand kind of combat again needs to be a priority. I also think that giving us bigger weapon variety is something that's very important, because that's something that I didn't really like about this game. I kind of forgot to mention this in the nitpick section, but I didn't like how there was only just a handgun, a shotgun, and a Tommy gun. And I also state this, I didn't really like the Tommy gun at the end of the day because it didn't really do that much damage. It kind of just felt like a gun that just took forever to load, and it wasn't as reliable as the handgun, in my opinion. It just felt like the damage output for the Tommy gun and the handgun were kind of the same, but one of them took longer to load. So I did prefer just using the shotgun or the handgun the majority of the game. Okay, so now we'll move on to the final section of the review, and that being the final score. Now, this was a little bit hard for me because honestly, it felt like I wanted to give the game a 6 out of 10. But as I said at the beginning of the video, I am taking into account that the game isn't at a regular price for new AAA games. So that kind of just, there was a little bit of wiggle room there in my rating. So as mentioned, the game is $60 USD. And of course, it is $50 if you have PlayStation Plus. So with that being said, I think personally, I feel more comfortable by giving this game a 7 out of 10. Because you know what? I had a blast playing this. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to click this one right here where we actually reviewed separate ways. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.